You'll notice at the very back, I attached a couple of sheets on the back of your notes. We're getting the plagues. We touched on, let's see. No, I guess it's this week. Sorry, I've been digging around in chapter 8 and 9. Here on the back, you'll kind of see, there's a couple of charts that I wanted to share with you. Just some things that you can share this week, you might want to share next week. Man, the plagues, again, the deeper you dig, there's representations of the gods, and we'll talk about that a little bit today and even next week, but there's also these super amazing, like the way that there's three groups of three in the plagues that we'll really highlight next week. Spend a little bit of time there in chapter 7 and 8, or 8 and 9. But it's just incredible the way that God works, His plan and His pattern, and all that He teaches us, even through the miracles of the plagues and His wrath. So again, those are there for you if you'd like to share some of those this week. Next week is when we'll do the plagues 2 through 7. We'll do the frogs through hell, and then we'll continue on after that. So I wanted to share an excerpt here at the very first. Again, this is from that book, the Exodus you almost passed over. There in the beginning of your notes. It says, first the Nile turns to blood. If you're a good upstanding polytheist, how do you react? You don't think the Creator has struck. You might instead say, as we've suggested, the river gods seem to be angry with us, and leave it at that until the next plague strikes. Now the frogs are here, in the beds, in the oven, the living room. You can't walk without stepping on frogs. And you conclude, well, the river god has teamed up with the amphibian god to strike your country. Most unfortunate. But then the third plague strikes. An alliance against you has evidently grown. It seems that the insect god has somehow gotten into the act. What other way to explain the tens of millions of lice that are suddenly infesting every Egyptian home? Do you get the picture? At this point, at what point does the elaborate intellectual edifice you are putting together collapse under its own weight? As plague upon plague hits, evincing a breathtaking array of natural forces, the slow accumulation of evidence starts to poke holes in the alliance theory of the plagues. Remember, in a polytheistic system, gods have rivalries because they are looking out for their own well-being. Alliances between gods are few and far between. At some point, you have to sit back and ask yourself, how many gods exactly are angry at us here? And at some point, the simplest explanation is, wait a minute, there's no alliance here at all. There must be one force in charge of all of this. One of the things that, when I was studying through this, that was noted is that when the plagues start, from the beginning of the plague to the end of the 10 plagues, 7 times, God will say, they will know that I am the Lord. I don't think that's a coincidence that God is, and we'll note this 7 throughout the plagues. There's this concept of 7 multiple times. There's kind of an echoing of creation, and again, we'll talk about that more next week. So we ended last week with Moses in chapter 6 saying, I am of uncircumcised lips. How will Pharaoh listen to me? We kind of talked a little bit about that concept of uncircumcised lips and what that means. Well, let's just go ahead. I'm going to read the whole chapter here real quick. Chapter 7, and then we'll kind of get to digging. Lord said to Moses, see, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay down my hand on Egypt and bring my host, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. when I stretch out my hand against Egypt, and brought out the people of Israel from among them. Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. Now Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron was 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, prove yourselves by working a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Still, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Verse 14, and the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning, as he's going out to the water. Stand on the bank of the Nile to meet him, and take in your hand the staff that turned into a serpent. And you shall say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But so far you have not obeyed. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, with this staff that is in my hand, I will strike the waters that is in the Nile, and it shall turn to blood. The fish in the Nile shall die, and the Nile will stink. The Egyptians will grow weary of drinking water from the Nile. And the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the rivers, the canals, the ponds, all the pools of water, so that they may become blood. And there shall be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, even in the vessels of wood and in the vessels of stone. Verse 20, Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded. In the sight of Moses, in the sight of Pharaoh, and in the sight of his servants, he lifted up his staff and struck the water in the Nile. And all the water in the Nile turned to blood, and the fish in the Nile died, and the Nile stank, so that the Egyptians could not drink from the water. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt, but the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned, went into his house. He didn't even take this to heart. All the Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink, for they couldn't drink the water of the Nile. 7 full days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. What observations, thoughts, questions? Let's hold off on questions. Let's do observations and thoughts first. We'll come back to questions.
You think magicians would be better employed countering the curse, not trying to mimic it?
Yeah.
You know, if they were really powerful, why didn't they stop the fish from dying by turning it back to water?
Right. Yeah, and next week, whenever they do that again with the frogs, I've noted Romans 1 where it says God gave them over to a depraved mind. It's just stupid. Like, the little bit of water we've got, you're going to turn to blood, you know? We've already got enough frogs, and now you're going to make more frogs. It's kind of ridiculous. But yeah, that's a great observation. Why didn't you flip that miracle on its head? That would have been cool. That would have been useful.
They would have had to dig in the sand to find the water to turn to blood. Because all the water had already been turned to blood.
That's what it seems like, right? Yes.
Found it interesting that when he throws the staff down and becomes a serpent, and the sorcerer did the same thing. It doesn't say that his snake swallowed their snakes. It says his staff swallowed their staff.
The language, yeah.
Yeah, the language in it.
Yeah.
Staff has always been kind of a symbol of power.
Right.
Or authority, maybe.
I read a couple of commentaries that suggested that the snake in verses 10 and 12 is a different word. But it's a word that meant large reptile or a sea or river monster. And one even suggested it could have been a Nile crocodile.
Interesting. I've read some that talked about how the snake, because we'll see some parallels in creation, specifically next week. Some commentators call it decreation. but how this snake might point back to Genesis 3. But we'll look at that next week. But yeah, I saw that as well. The sea monster is what I had read on that, how it was translated potentially the sea monster.
It probably doesn't mean anything, but it's interesting because it says his walking stick ate theirs, not the snake.
Mm-hmm.
ate theirs.
Right.
Odd.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the play between Moses' staff and Aaron's staff, I don't know whether that means anything or not.
I don't know either. Yeah, I thought that was interesting as well because it seems like Moses is making the Nile, and then Aaron's kind of taking care of everything else. So yeah, that's interesting. Which we'll note again next week. We'll note that all three of these first plagues begin at the Nile. This is where everything kind of Exodus 1, verse 20, 21, 22. They're at the end of Genesis 1. That's where everything kind of fell apart in the genocide, verse 20, 22, where he threw all the children in. And that's where God begins. The Nile will be turned to blood, the frogs will come from the Nile, the gnats will come from the dust, but again, it's all around the Nile. These the first three plagues.
So, one thing I did notice, when the staff turns into a serpent, this is Aaron's staff. And when we first see the sign, it's with Moses' staff. Because it says, where was it? Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. So it's just weird how we first see that the sign was with Moses' staff, but now they're using Aaron's.
Yeah, they're in verse 9, 10, and 11.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's Moses gave Aaron his staff. It seems like he has his own separate staff that Aaron cast down. Yeah, and it does specifically talk about Aaron's staff. Yeah, verse 12. Yeah, it was a good observation. What about repeated words? Repeated words or phrases, did y'all notice any of those? Any of those jump out to you?
Hardened.
Hardened, yeah, that's mentioned 4 times.
Look at the first two instances of the Egyptians will know that I'm God.
Right.
I'm the Lord.
Yeah. Just kind of the ones that are obvious. Moses and Aaron are both 11 times. Pharaoh's 18 times. The Lord's 14 times. I noted the word did, because it referred to the obedience specifically. It's mentioned 7 times in the text, but 4 of those times talks about how Moses and Aaron were both obedient.
I'm seeing commanded in that at least twice between verse 1 and 13.
Commanded her, yes. The Lord commanded them. Blood was the one that really stuck out to me. In verse 21, there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. Just a picture of that. And again, some of these graphic words that are mentioned in here, that it stank, and you think about fish floating to the top. We talked about this a little bit. You think about the cleanup. I mean, what are you doing with all this fish? What are you doing with all this? The Egyptians, they couldn't take the water, so then they kind of dig side things here on the Nile, which I think even points to God's grace that He allowed them to have drinking water even from. They had to dig for it, but there's still grace in that. That God mercy, I guess, that they were able to find some water to drink. I don't know what the amount of time is that you can go without water, but probably not 7 days. That'd be very good. Not very good for you.
I did also realize that it specifically said that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. So the Israelites are still able to drink the water.
Well, the Israelites on the first, it's not until the 4th plague of the flies where it specifically notes Goshen will not be touched.
Got it. Okay.
So the first three, it seems like they got to deal with it just like the Egyptians have to deal with
Got it.
you
Okay.
know? The Nile, the frogs, and then the gnats. But again, there's this clear distinction in chapter 4, or the fourth plague, where it's like no longer will Egypt have to, rather the Goshen, the land of Goshen
Yeah.
Israelites have to deal with that.
Okay.
But yeah, you're right. It does specifically say that, but I mean, I think they would have gotten their water from there as well. Goshen was a flood zone,
Mm.
so from the Nile, so I think they probably would have had to deal with this as well. But, you know, ultimately, our hope is in bless you. Ultimately, our hope is in Jesus, but we have to go through some of the trials in this life that the wickedness, the evil, often bring about. So kind of, I noted this section, Exodus 6:28 through chapter 7, because this is this continuous thought. Moses is telling God, I can't, I'm the wrong guy, I'm not eloquent of speech. He uses some versions translate it, I'm of uncircumcised lips. You know, how will Pharaoh listen to me? But God, again, in his grace, he just reminds him, this is what's going to happen, and this is how it's going to go down. Just seems to reiterate what he's already promised. I think I noted, I don't know if I put that in your notes, he's already mentioned this in chapter 3, verse 10, chapter 4, verse 15, 16, 22, and 23. God says this is what's going to happen. I told you this before, and this is kind of how it's going to go. Pharaoh, God warns Moses, Pharaoh's going to harden his heart. Again, this was mentioned in chapter 3, this was mentioned in chapter 4. You'll remember all the way back to Genesis 15, which, when I kind of did the math, best I can figure, 620 to 654 years prior to this moment, God was telling Abraham, he's going to harden his heart. He's not going to let him go. They're going to be enslaved for a time, which, for me, I just thought to myself, you know, what does that teach me about God? What does that show me about God, about his ability to, I think it was last week, we kind of talked about how God's outside of time. God sees all, he's able to see all time at once, you know, and whew, yeah, just incredible to, it's beyond our ability to understand how God sees time, but I don't know, just, you know, think about 6 centuries ahead of time. I mean, I would love to know what's going to happen with the economy in a couple of months. You know, you can either buy or sell. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you can get rich off this deal. God knows centuries in advance. This is how it's going to go down.
So God changed his name, and that part of what his name assumes is that he's timeless, as he began to say that's who he really is. Maybe he was saying he was timeless. Maybe that is his name.
That he's
That is his name. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Outside
was,
of
I
time.
am. You know, I was, I am, I will be.
Will be,
That
yes.
means timeless.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the theme of this, really.
Yeah.
God's not surprised at any of it.
Right.
He knew what was going to happen. He allowed it to happen.
And he's not in a hurry. I mean, there's just so many things.
Yeah.
You know, there's so many things as you think about what those 600 some odd years mean, those generations mean.
So that they may know.
Right.
And John, so that they may know.
Yeah. And again, I think I mentioned that. Yeah. At the end, we'll talk about Romans. No. I guess I do mention Romans 1 here at the end. But there's also a Romans passage. I'll see if we get to it. If we don't today, yeah, it's in Romans 9. So again, God said, you know, Egypt will know him, and it's more than simply knowing his name. It's understanding his nature, his character, his power, his might. These plagues were about revealing who Yahweh really is. From this point, Moses and Aaron, there'll still be some bucking, but they begin to follow his orders. You'll see this consistently throughout the stories. They did as they were told. They weren't flawless, but generally, when God said to do something, they did it. There was some complaining. I will not argue that. but we see a shift with Moses and Aaron. Verse 7. This is one of those things that, you know, it might, in many ways, I think it would, the fact that it mentions them by age, that Moses was 80, Aaron was 83. This would be a great way to date this book or this story, except for the fact we don't know the dynasty. We don't know, well, some do. But we're not really told who this guy is or any other markers, you know, with others, you know, like you think Isaiah in the, I don't remember what year it is, in the first year of King Uzziah, I think it is. But there's these markers. Luke's really good about all these historical markers. You know the date. You're able to date it. And mentioning that they're 80 and 83, this would be a great way to know when this happened, except we don't even know the Pharaoh. So I asked the question there in verse 7. It's kind of a weird detail to me that their age is mentioned. What kind of implications do you think that has for us? I think we mentioned this maybe the very first week. We talked a little bit about this, but what thoughts do you have there on them mentioning the fact that they're 80 and 83?
It took them 80 years to actually get to start fulfilling their calling.
Yeah, that's crazy to think about. I don't know my ministry now and what I'm supposed to be doing now. I don't even want to wait till next year. I prayed about it for a week, Lord. Where's the answer? You know, and they're 80 years into their life before they know. Before they really begin.
Terry Mason said, I'm 85 in my class. I said, what have you been doing for the last 5 years then?
There you go. You're supposed to do something great when you get to 80.
You've done something great in the preached 80.
There you go. That is pretty great. This is true. Yeah. Just making it to 80 is great.
Well, Moses thought he was ready at 40.
Right?
I mean, he took steps to show his, but God had to have Moses trust in God, not in Moses.
Hmm.
And so I find it interesting, his language about his shortcomings. As you pointed out, he mentions again, even after God, you know, dealt with all his excuses, he mentions again, I'm a man of faltering lips. He's been humble, and he recognizes where the real power is.
Yeah, good.
He's reminded of that a little bit in the beginning of the chapter, chapter 7, where it talks about how Moses is going to be like God to the people, and Aaron is going to be his prophet or his mouthpiece. Those are very familiar words going back to chapter 4, as Moses is arguing with God and essentially says the same thing, but he's going to be like God to the people, not to Pharaoh, but to the people, and Aaron is going to be his prophet to the people. That it's not Moses that's doing this, it's God that's doing this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the key thing, I think, is the Egyptians needed to understand that, the Israelites needed to understand that, and Moses needed to understand that.
One thing that was brought up in my class last Sunday is that destroying the gods were probably not even just for the Egyptians. Because I've always thought that they were destroying the gods of the Egyptians with all the plagues. But then you realize the Israelites have been living among the Egyptians for 400 years. And this is enforcing the idea that, hey, you have been around these gods, I'm going to destroy them in front of you so you can trust me. And this is the beginning of that process where he's destroying the gods for the Israelites in order to allow them to trust him. And the same thing happens with Moses. It takes a little convincing at first, but he's using Moses to essentially smite the gods. And this is also helping Moses learn, okay, there's something bigger going on. And I'm not going to complain as much.
No bad, I'm gonna do what he says,
Yeah. Because if you read it, he doesn't even question, or at least it's not written down that he questions anything that God tells him to do in this chapter. He just does it.
It seems like after God reiterates what he's wanting to happen. A couple times it says he did it. Yeah.
I suspect that word command in
Mhm.
verse 2 had a lot to do with that. When God commands something, if you're not falling flat on your face, then you're doing it.
I love it that God's, as a competitive person, I love it that God's seems always ready for a good contest, whether it's here, Elijah, and the contest that he was part of. Let's see who the real God is.
Show me what you got.
Yeah, again, I mean, the very first, coming right out of the gate, blood fills the whole land. I mean, you are way outmatched here. You know, this is like, it's time to back down. You should have backed down a chapter or two ago, but yeah, I mean, from the beginning, it's just covered in blood. Stench of death is in the air. Yeah, God starts off pretty big here. And of course, this is their life force. I mean, life source. This is their lifeline. This is where they get their water, they get their food, water their crops. So from the very beginning, this is a huge blow.
I mean, if the god of the Nile was angry with them, he'd flood them, or it wouldn't show up, which had happened a couple of times. The waters had stopped up in the higher regions further south. That's what a god does when he's angry with you. But to turn to blood and to kill everything in it just seems like something worked on the god there. You know?
Yeah.
And if you remember, I said last week that the worldview of these nations like the Canaanites and others is that if there's a conquest between two nations, the nation that's victorious acquires the gods
Right.
of that nation.
Yeah.
Which is why there's so many similarities in the gods, even in their names across the ancient world. But what we read here is unique because we're not following that script at all. We're completely the opposite. This God's showing up and revealing himself, and he's attacking their gods and destroying them one by one.
Yeah.
He's the one fighting for the people. The people aren't fighting for God.
Yeah.
Well, Pharaoh dismisses it pretty quickly because I believe Moses says, can we go into the desert for 3 days and celebrate with our God? That's so totally foreign to their viewpoint of their gods. You don't celebrate with your gods. You have no relationship with these gods. They're either angry with you or they leave you alone. So it's tough I think it's tough for Pharaoh to even give it a second thought because no God would do that.
Yeah.
And since his magicians were able to recreate on a smaller scale, turning water to blood, he's probably passing Moses and Aaron off as just two more magicians, really good magicians, but not even doing it as a god, just still a magician trick.
It's just a trick. It's sleight of hand.
Yeah. We'll note with the frog specifically how Pharaoh wants precision in that, even in the stopping of it. It's very interesting. I noted there, you know, we always say seeing is believing. You know, if you can see it, you believe it. I'm reminded of that passage, the rich man and Lazarus, where the rich man says, just send somebody back, send Lazarus back, and they'll believe. And God says, if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. You would think that seeing this would impact the people. This would impact Pharaoh. This would be something that, again, he would tap. But once he sees that his men can duplicate it, I have such a hard time separating this because in my head I see the cartoon characters Steve Martin and Martin Short from The Prince of Egypt. You're playing with the big boys now. For those of you who have seen that movie, I always picture the two of them doing their magic. Let's see here. Yeah. So again, God told Moses and Aaron what to do. They did it, but this was not enough to convince Moses. And I can almost, as I was reading through this and studying, I could almost hear Pharaoh snap of the finger, as if to say, yeah, I'm not impressed. In the words of Santi, I'm not impressed. This is, my guys can do this, it's no big deal. Some commentators believe that this secret magic is done by Satan or evil. Some people believe it's just a David Copperfield sleight of hand. I personally believe it is. They literally do it. I think they literally change the stick to snake, that they change the water to blood, that they're able to produce frogs. The reason why I believe that is because when you get to the third plague, they can't reproduce the gnats. And they say this is the finger of God. And so for them to acknowledge there's something bigger going on here, this isn't any small thing. I personally, I hold the conviction. You hold your own conviction, and that's fine. I'll still call you a brother. Hopefully you'll call me one. But I believe they actually did this. I believe that this was an evil force at work. I think the enemy gave them power to be able to do these things. But again, it's not.
It's a little bit harder to do sleight of hand though with lice and gnats than it is with frogs and staffs.
Well, seems like you'd be able to, if you could produce more frogs, and if you could turn water to blood, if you could turn your snake to staff to a snake. But again, either way.
Part of my reading said that the snake charmers today can turn a snake to a snake. They can touch a part of the body that stiffens up enough to where it could be picked up as a staff.
Yeah.
Not the other way around.
Yeah.
I will say, if it was,
He's the expert.
well, this is just something that, if it was just sleight of hand, the magicians would know that it was sleight of hand. And they're doing this to prove that the Egyptian gods are real. And it's like, okay, you're lying to your audience and you're misdirecting them. How do you believe in an Egyptian god when you're doing it? Type thing.
There's
I'm not
power.
sure that's the forefront of their mind. I think survival is at the forefront
Yeah.
of their
Yeah.
mind.
That's a big factor, but
If
also
they fail, they will be.
yeah,
Yeah.
die.
But
Yeah,
it's one of those things where it's like, I bet the devil was definitely a part of this. Because otherwise it was like, kind of just, it wouldn't make sense to me why you would just do sleight of hand and still believe in the Egyptian gods.
Well, and I'll be happy to talk to you more about that later.
Yeah.
I have some thoughts. I appreciate what you're saying. What my point is, though, is either way, the staff of Aaron's ate theirs. So either way, whatever they produced, whether it was a David Copperfield situation or actual turning a staff into a snake, this was God won. Romans 9:17. Do I have that listed there on your paper?
Yes.
Okay. Scripture says to Pharaoh, for this reason, Paul's writing this obviously later to the church at Rome. this very reason I have raised you up, Pharaoh, that I might show my power. God saying I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. Even through this story, through the grace that we see God offer, the mercy we see God offer, God had a purpose in there, and this was to make his name mighty throughout all the earth. I know some people really wrestle with the hardening of heart and different things there. I believe that God worked with what was there. I believe God gave opportunity after opportunity to show Pharaoh, you can back down, but eventually he wouldn't. And so again, Romans 1, I think, talks about, gave them over to a depraved mind. And so,
But if I understand it right, the first 4 plagues, Pharaoh hardened his heart. The last 6, God hardened his heart. If you want to get specific about that and literal.
sure,
So it's kind of like he gave him a chance, 4 plagues.
sure.
And then he said, gave up and kept on hardening.
Yeah, and again, the fact that he did 10, that's clearly mercy. It's clearly grace, clearly opportunity for him to back down, but he never did. And so, yeah. Chapter 7, 14 through 25. See the water to blood. God tells Moses, here's what's going to happen. But note what Moses was to do. He says, let's see there in verse
I don't know, just jumping back a second.
yeah, go ahead.
You just made me think of 2 Thessalonians 2:9. The coming of the lawless ones by the activity of Satan, with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing, because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. Therefore God sends them a strong delusion so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth but had pleasure in unrighteousness. So that they were already in a settled practice of refusing to love the truth, and it's at that point that God hands them over. And I think that's where the hardening really takes place there. I mean, that's what he's describing there, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost would fit Pharaoh, wouldn't it?
Sure.
And his magicians,
Yeah.
what he's saying there.
Yeah.
I know we're talking about a Roman emperor, but in a direct context, but there seems to be a similarity.
Yeah, definite connection, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Paul will say test the spirits, and
Uh-huh.
Satan can, masquerade as an angel of light. So there's a lot of things there about the power of the evil one, but then also, how God allows those things to, if that's where they're going to go, God allows that. You get what you want. If you want God and you seek Him, you will find Him. He's promised that.
But when
But
there's
if you don't want Him,
when there's a determination on the part of the individual or individuals to practice something that's against God, there's only so long
yeah.
before that's going to really become irredeemable. Now, I'm not saying that God couldn't do something that might
Sure.
alter that, but it's becoming much, much more unlikely.
Right. Yeah.
It makes a lot more sense with the character of God. It's more in line with the character of God than God hardening his heart. I think God can't do whatever he does, but if God is the only one that's really good, is he really going to harden the heart of a man?
Yeah.
Because his prophet said, God wants to take your heart of stone and turn it into a heart of flesh. Just warm it up and heal you. And if God's bringing order to the chaos, I don't buy in that he hardened Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh hardened his heart when he became stubborn. In the beginning, he didn't believe. I think we'll find that Pharaoh actually began to believe.
Sure.
And then he said, I don't care.
Right.
Anyway.
Right.
So I can't, there's something bigger than God hardening the heart of a stubborn man.
It's an indirect action, it's not a direct action.
Correct.
In the readings I did, apparently there's 2 different Hebrew words that are translated the same for hardening. First one is stubborn and the second one is strengthening. It seems like every time it says that God hard his heart, actual words for strengthening, or being, giving him courage or something. I'm not sure how that fits into the story, that God is making Pharaoh's heart courageous to continue to do it. But the time when it says that Pharaoh's heart is, it's the one referred to being stubborn.
Yeah, and again, we'll note later, his own people are begging him, you gotta stop, please stop. There's, yeah, even by three, like I said earlier, there is this, the magicians begin to acknowledge this is God, this is the finger of God. Kind of a side note, we'll come back to this, but verse 15, we'll note next week that there are 3 threes in the plagues. It's very clear, and I'll show you those next week. But the first 3 are connected, 4 through 6 are connected, 7 through 9 are connected. But what's really, really crazy is you begin to read through these. So the first miracle or plague of each one of these 3s has a connection. The second of each one of these 3s has a connection. And the third of each one of these 3s has a connection. Just real quick side reference here. Verse 15, God tells him, go in the morning. He'll say that in plague 1. He'll say that in plague 4. He'll say that in plague 7. Those are the first of the 3 sections. Then in the second one, he'll tell him, go to Pharaoh's house. On plague 2, plague 5, and plague 8. So each one of these, like I said, we'll spend a little bit of time on that next week. But it's crazy how these are linked and how God is working through these and showing something. Again, all 3 of these begin at the Nile. It begins with the blood at the Nile. Now, arguably, you could say, well, the babies drowned. They didn't bleed. Throw a baby to a crocodile in the river, see if there's not some blood. I mean, yes, they did drown. They drowned, but the genocide was about drowning, obviously. But there's animals in there that are going to eat those babies, and there's going to be blood in the river. It's horrible to think about, but these first 3 plagues begin with blood, and they're all surrounding the Nile as they happen. So like I said, we'll come back to that. But you'll note there in chapter 7, verse 16 through 18, Moses was, by the way, this is a consequence. This is a consequence. It says in verse 16, but so far you have not obeyed. So the Nile turning to blood is actually a consequence. This isn't some kind of threat, or if you won't do it, then this is a consequence of prior action that Pharaoh didn't listen. But the consequences of Pharaoh's refusal. But so God tells him, it says who sent him, the Lord's demands, Pharaoh's previous response, God's purpose in sending the plague, and then what the plague would involve. That's kind of how it's broken down. So I asked the question, why didn't God just speak directly to Pharaoh? Why didn't God show up as the angel of the Lord? Or why wasn't there a burning bush for Pharaoh? Why didn't he come to him in a dream? We noted in Genesis a few times where in a dream, God came to somebody and said, with Sarah, I don't remember, one time it was Pharaoh, I'm sorry?
I think it was Abimelech.
Abimelech, yeah. Pharaoh and Abimelech, yeah. Well, I was thinking of Sarah. Anyways, God comes to him in a dream, and then, they come to Pharaoh, to Abraham. Why didn't you tell us she was your wife, So why didn't God do that with Pharaoh? Why wasn't there some physical form or physical manifestation of God just to say, hey, stop? I don't have an answer for this, by the way.
Because what Moses is doing is not just for Pharaoh, it's for the Israelites as well.
It's for the Israelites, yes.
So if God just speaks to Pharaoh,
Private audience and the rest don't get the message. It's a good thought.
It's about God's glorification overall. Think about what's about to happen when they leave Egypt. They're going to be going to the promised land and conquering nations, and this is a real problem for a lot of people. All the nations, including women and children, were slaughtered.
Animals, yeah.
Animals, everything is slaughtered.
Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing is, word about this Yahweh God is way ahead of the Israelites.
Oh, yeah.
They know what he's done in Egypt.
Yeah.
What I find merciful and gracious about that from our great God is that he gave them that information passed orally in order to give them a chance to change their ways, to change their worldview, to look to him, and they didn't do it. So God is bringing his glory through all this, and the Israelites are carrying out his justice after these people are given evidence, not from friendly witnesses, but from unfriendly witnesses about this Yahweh who he destroyed our river god and our, whatever god the Egyptians had. So I see great mercy subtly under all of this as God uses these plagues to send a message to everyone about his glory.
Yeah. That's a great observation. My mind instantly went to Rahab. She tells all that we've heard about your God. And God did save their family.
That's exactly
Because of her faith, because of taking care of that, yeah.
God always brags about, I think you're right, Dale, but God brags about talking to Moses face to face when he confronts Miriam and Aaron too. That's a big deal to God to be able to talk to somebody face to face like he did Moses. And Moses writes about it too, so it didn't happen very often.
Sure.
I mean, I don't know, talk to Adam and Eve face to face, it didn't happen very often.
Yeah.
Even when he appeared other places, it was as an angel. It wasn't necessarily, didn't look like God, but Moses got to do that, and I don't think God's gonna share that with Pharaoh.
That's a good point, yeah.
Well, and let's not forget, Pharaoh's seen by the people as who?
As a God.
As a god.
Right.
So it wouldn't do for the Egyptians to find out that this God of the Israelites has been talking to our God privately.
Sure.
They'd expect that.
Sure.
So, we're not going down that road.
And if he did go to Pharaoh in a dream, he'd be like, oh, another god to add to the list. Check. Another god to worship.
Well, God's already come to a Pharaoh in dreams. Back in Joseph's time.
Okay.
And Pharaoh didn't know what in the world was going on. He didn't understand it at all.
Cows eating cows.
And his Egyptian advisors didn't understand it either.
Sure.
It's Joseph
Yeah.
gets involved. This Pharaoh also, he ain't ready.
Yeah.
God comes to him, and it'd be like God appearing to the boy Samuel. Say, what do you want, Eli?
Right.
Not recognizing God at all coming to him.
Yeah.
And if he recognized him as a God coming to him, okay, we'll add you to our list of gods here. What visually do you can I look at that shows me who you are?
Sure.
Because everything of the Egyptians that was something visual, and the concept of God appearing to him as Lord, definitely foreign. I like what Foreman says prior to, in that chapter prior to, which where you quoted there, he talks about the purpose of God coming here, and part of the purpose was for Israel, yes, but the other purpose that they come to know God. And even more than that, as he goes on and talks about the Egyptian gods were not gods of morality at all. And so he talks about how could Pharaoh have thrown babies into the river and stuff, and how could he live with himself at all? And Foreman's answer is he did it because he could do it. And these were the gods. They did things because this is the way they did it. And so to defeat those gods brings a moral principle into you. It's immoral to be slave to these people.
Yeah. That's good. That goes back to him talking about being Elohim or El Shaddai, just essentially a power, known as a power, and God revealing himself as so much more than that. Again, the one that really struck out to me was verse 19, that there was going to be blood everywhere. You know, I just, the mental picture of that in the symbolic nature, the reality, but even the symbolic nature of that, that all water everywhere was going to have blood. I think that was so powerful.
What's the symbolism you're talking about?
Death. I mean,
Yeah.
just defeat, utter defeat. I mean, when you come across a battlefield, you know, it's just bodies everywhere and blood everywhere. You know, so it's just that death.
Is there a screaming out from the river for all the babies that were?
Yeah, I think there's definitely that is part of it. I do.
If
Again,
you've got blood in all your vessels of wood and stone, which you obviously use on a daily basis, and you can't clean it with anything, then that becomes a matter of serious uncleanness.
Mhm.
So,
Sure.
in the eyes of the Egyptians, I believe.
yeah.
You know, Dale mentions how many times God showed mercy of you going through 10 plagues. You know, Pharaoh could have changed his mind at any time and said,
Yeah.
okay,
Right.
and fully believe. But it just shows you how bad his heart was.
Mm.
Because I mean, if you get down to losing the firstborn child of every person in the land, and you let him go, but then you still change your mind and go after him. Pharaoh's heart's not just hardened.
Yeah.
It's,
Malevolent.
yeah.
Yeah.
He's got a lot to lose. He's got a lot to lose here. I mean, from the very beginning, he suspicions there's more going on here than just a 3-day journey in the wilderness.
And then they carry on another 3 days.
Well, it's
And
almost like he's
direction
saying,
coming
how
back.
dare you fear your God more than you fear me?
He's properly afraid that he's gonna lose them as slaves, and why do a lot of people refuse to repent today? Because I got a lot to give up if I do.
So, just to kind of hit fast forward, sorry. Yeah, the magicians were able to do the same, and this seems to be the turning point where Pharaoh doesn't really care when he sees them do the same thing. As Bruce pointed out, this is the stupidest miracle of all time. It's like, dude, we need water, and water we get, you're turning to blood. And so again, this is just, you know, God giving them over to a depraved mind, to a foolish mind. But again, as Jess pointed out, this appears to still be some drinking water. So we'll talk a little bit about the time frame of the plagues, because that's always the question. We'll talk a little bit about that next week, but this is the only time that a time frame is mentioned specifically. There'll be day to the next day kind of thing, and we'll note that as well. But 7 days, the last verse of the chapter, which again, 7 is very powerful throughout this whole time. So next week we're going to look at, I put just Exodus 9, I'm sorry. Put 8 and 9 there on that last page. We're going to be looking at 8 and 9. I've asked Dewey to put those on Facebook. Jess, I forgot, what did you ask me? You had asked me last week and I didn't.
We had talked about, the schedule was going to change from the original schedule that you gave.
Oh, yeah, thank you. So November 3rd, we are not going to have the missions. Excuse me, Gil Sanchez is going to teach our class on November 3rd. And so, yes, our schedule will change. I'll need to get that to you this week. I have that as Exodus 10 and 11, which is funny. When I did 8 and 9, I was like, there's no way you can do 2 chapters a week. So now we're going to do 4. I really want to spend time, though. We might just kind of highlight 10 and 11 because I really want to spend time, obviously, on Passover and really give that, because that's kind of climactic of all this, and that's not part of the 3 sets of 3 and so many things. But you might just, let's see. Okay, so chapter 8, there's 3 plagues. Oh, this is all messed up. I'll probably need to redo these questions and send them to you again, because I have Exodus 9. Spend time in Exodus 9. Put yourself in the story. Why were the 3 plagues? That's actually chapter 3. The frogs, the gnats, and the flies.
Mine says spend time in Exodus 8.
Yours says 8?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I guess I just changed mine to 9 then. My notes.
We
But
have 8 and 9 on the original schedule.
okay. There's 3 copies floating around out there. Anyways,
What edition have I got?
Mine says 8. Mine says 9.
yours says 9? How's that possible? 3 copies of the exact same. Okay. Anyways, I just wanted to give them a few questions to consider. Which are the worst of those 3 plagues? Would it be the frogs, the gnats, or the flies? I don't know. They would all be pretty horrific. Why was Israel affected by the first 3 plagues, but not the 4th? And then, just imagine you're an Egyptian. I mean, sometimes we feel powerless, coming up with Tuesday, what is it, the 5th? Tuesday the 5th? November 5th is when the voting election? Yeah. Sometimes you feel powerless as just, my one vote. Imagine these Egyptians under a dictator dynasty that was just, this guy was doubling down every time. And, we talked about it getting worse for the Israelites before it got better with the straw and stuff. It never got better with the Egyptians. It just kept getting worse. And it seems like the majority of the people were powerless. So I've given you way too much. Cover what you can. But I think there's some really good things there about God's mercy, about God's justice and God's vengeance, and mankind. Sometimes we're pretty stubborn.
There's a general rule of thumb, a person can survive without water for about 3 days.
3 days, okay. Thank you.
And just for clarity, all the adult classes will be in the auditorium on November the 3rd, and Gil will be teaching the class in an unrelated topic.